Okay, we have the voice with us, Josh Waters. We're going to start in chapter 21, verse 27, and we've got a busy schedule today. We're going to go through chapter 23. So this, if there's any portion, well, this is one of the portions of Acts that I think that you could make a movie out of. There's a lot of things that happen here in what we're going to look at today. So I want to give you a little introduction, and those folks that are coming in a little bit late, they're going to miss it because they're not going to know where they are here. But I want to just have a few slides to tell us a little bit about what's going to go on. So if you're going to get the rest of the lesson today, it behooves one to look at these first few slides so that we know where we're at and what's going on, okay? So this is the setting. I know all of you are tremendous English students and all that type of thing, and you started off with a setting as to where the novel was taking place. So you might recall from Acts 20:16 that Paul said that, he had decided that he was going to sail past Ephesus to avoid spending time in the province of Asia. In fact, the Spirit at one time, as you recall, had warned him not to go into the province of Asia, but he was sailing past it because he was in a hurry to reach Jerusalem, if possible, by the day of Pentecost. The day of Pentecost, okay, here we go, a little bit of review. The day of Pentecost, how many days after Passover? 50 days after Passover, right? It was a grand festival with millions of people gathered in Jerusalem. So we're going to see these guys reappear today. These fellows are the defenders of the old order. Back in chapter 6, they were one of the primary culprits as to why Stephen was martyred. And they came, you're going to see that they come from the province of Asia. These are the hardheads. These are the guys that are still relying upon the old law, and they're going to accuse Paul of some things, and you'll see that here in just a little bit. We're going to go to this place, and Paul is going. You're going to see that he's here at the Temple Mount, and I think we had this slide back in the early section of Acts, but just as a reminder here, one of the things that you'll see is the Jews are going to basically say that Paul has brought Gentiles into the temple. Well, there was a warning stone that was at the balustrade, and the balustrade is where the arrow is pointing to around the temple there. And in this balustrade around the temple was this stone up on the upper left that if you ever get to go to the Israeli Antiquities Society, or the museum there in Jerusalem, you'll be able to see this stone. There's also one in Constantinople in Turkey. But this stone says, and it was in a number of places around this balustrade around the temple, in the red there you can see that it says, "No stranger," and to them that would have been Gentiles or anyone from around the world. No stranger is to enter within the balustrade around the temple and enclosure. Whoever is caught will be responsible to himself for his death, which will ensue. So you might remember that there was a temple guard. There was a Jewish temple guard. But you're also going to see later on, you'll see those columns back at the back right back there. You'll see that that's called the Antonia Fortress. And you'll see Roman guards coming out of there as we get into the scripture here a little bit later on. On this stone, they wanted to make sure everyone could understand, at least those who could read. It was written in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew on this stone. Still exists today. They found this probably, 30 or 40 years ago. And there's two of them, again, that still exist. So Paul, we're going to have as our setting here a portion of this in the temple grounds. So I just mentioned this a second ago, but here at the Antonia Fortress at the corner was built, of course Herod built this temple, and at the corner back there at this temple was a Roman fortress. They made it just high enough to where they, in fact by Jewish, not command, but by recommendation of the Jews, they made it big enough so that they could see what was going on inside of the court of the Gentiles, which is on both sides of the main temple. But they made it to where they couldn't actually get up. It wasn't of elevation enough to where they could see in the temple. So this was the official headquarters of the Roman army in Jerusalem. And you'll see that there are people that fog out of here in a little bit to protect Paul because they find out that he's a Roman citizen. So the commander of this garrison, which is not named, but it'll be referred to as the commander a number of times here in the scripture today, he was the head of the garrison, and his title was Chiliarch. Now, they didn't have chili cook-offs back at the time. He wasn't the commander of the chili cook-offs. He was the chiliarch, and a chiliarch captained 1,000 soldiers. This would almost be like lieutenant general or something in our day and time, but had 1,000 soldiers underneath him. It was a tenth of a legion, and 10 centurions were underneath this chiliarch. Now, as we get into the scripture a little bit later on, when they find out that Paul is a Roman citizen, you're going to see that they were serious about keeping Paul protected, because there were 470 soldiers that are going to escort him pretty much all the way to Caesarea. They go to Antipatris, but then before they go to Caesarea, some of them stop, and the cavalry goes on with Paul to protect him to go to Caesarea. So a little background. So we're going to go to Acts 21, and we're going to go, Josh is going to read for us 17 through 40. So we'll see that they go, Paul and the people that are traveling with him go to Jerusalem, and there's some interesting things here as far as when they report to the church there in Jerusalem. The elders and all of the others basically request Paul to go through a purification ritual for some reason. Had Paul been through a purification ritual back in chapter 9? Hello? Had Paul already been through not the type of Jewish purification ritual? He underwent baptism, did he not? That was a purification ritual that he went through early on. But they're demanding that he go through a purification ritual, basically to counteract, I don't thoroughly believe this, rumors that Christianity was anti-Jewish. But anyway, we'll see how that works into this story here in just a minute. So follow along as Josh reads to us Acts 21, and we're going to go 17 through 26, and we'll stop and make some comments, and then we'll go on from there. Josh?
When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present.
Now this James here, this is who? Excuse me, Josh. This James here is who? Brother of Jesus, right? Elder in the Jerusalem church. Okay. Just so we know who everybody is here.
Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them.
So, what's involved in this Old Testament purification rite, R-I-T-E? What's involved in a purification rite? What would they have had to have done? You remember from the Old Testament? If someone was deemed to be unclean, if they'd come close to a dead body, if they had, heaven forbid, gone into the house of a Gentile, right? And they had become unclean. How was it that they became purified? Again, y'all don't remember anything from the first part of Acts when we taught it. They had a series of purifications that they had to go through. They had these baths called mikvahs. And in the mikvahs, they had to bathe themselves for a number of days, and they had to go through all of the purification again. So there was a rich history of being washed in water in the Old Testament. As far as the priests, as far as those who would become unclean, they had to purify themselves. So now, let me ask a question here. Why did Paul do this? Why did he succumb to the pressure of the elders and the others who were Jews there? Why did he succumb to this? Why did he want to do this again? Raymond?
Yeah, Paul told us why in 1 Corinthians 9. Although I am free from
Bingo! Right on the head. That's exactly right, Raymond. So Paul was concerned, in fact, we'll see him in a little bit. He's going to deliver the last gospel sermon to these Jews before he departs, and he goes to Rome, and they'll never see him again. So he's doing this basically so that he is an offensive to some of his brethren, and so that they might listen to the message, the gospel, so that they might hear the message and they might respond. Now, what we're going to see here in a little bit, we're going to see how they respond. All right? And it's not pleasant. This is the movie part of it. Okay. So, in verse 24 it says, "Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you." Really? "But that you yourself are living in obedience to the law." So, Paul is going to make an impression here that he's going to go through a purification rite. They're going to shave their heads, and this sounds an awful lot like a Nazirite vow that was taken in the Old Testament to a certain degree, to where you actually made a vow to the Lord that you were going to be dedicated to the Lord. So Paul purified himself. Okay, we pick up here in verse 27, and we're going to go through 36. Josh?
When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple.
Okay, hold on just a second. That's the guys you saw in the picture just a minute ago, right? These are the hardheads that you see coming from Asia that are going to, they're coming from out of town, and they're the hardheads. They're the guys that are going, and Paul writes about these folks later on. If you don't believe it, look at the book of Galatians, okay? What he's talking about, these guys that are depending upon the law. Okay, go ahead. Wait a minute. Don't go. So it says some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul. How would they know who he is? I mean, speculate with me. How would they know who Paul is? Huh? They recognize him, but how? I mean, they're from Asia. They're from northwest Turkey. How would they know about Paul? Well, he'd been there, right? And they'd all heard about him. And Paul, remember, in his own description of himself, said he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was under Gamaliel, studied under Gamaliel at the Hillel School of Praise in Jerusalem. He was well known across Judaism. It wasn't like that it was some guy that was just walking in off the street. He was a renowned person. So that's how these guys come in and they see Paul at the temple. Also, they're very aware of how Paul had risen to be this, let's call it a carrier of the message of Christ. They knew. And in fact, all of these people knew about Jesus Christ as well. Do you know that? They all knew about him. They all knew what had happened in Jerusalem. They'd heard. And how this to them, and you have to go back to what we talked about a month ago, this frame of reference that they had built among themselves is what was ultimately important as far as their salvation and as far as who they were. Paul was a person that was absolutely in opposition to that. Paul wasn't, Christ was. But Paul, being his apostle, is basically in opposition to what these people believe. We're going to see that they've just become really, really violent here in a little bit. I mean, it's amazing how violent they become because of Paul and his message. Okay, I don't even know where you were. Go ahead.
They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple.
Hold on. Two lies, right? He's teaching everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. Is that true? Sound like a lawyer, don't? Hope no lawyers in here. He's basically, they're basically lying about him. The second lie is that he brought Greeks into the temple. Now we're talking about that he actually would have taken the Trophimus, the Ephesian, and a Greek, by the way, they just classify those as Gentiles. It doesn't make any difference if you're a Greek or what you are. If you're a Gentile, if you're of the nations, you're called a Greek. Greeks into the temple, and defiled this holy place. Now, what I didn't mention a second ago when we were looking at the temple, you could go into the court of the Gentiles as a place of prayer, but you couldn't go into the temple if you were a Gentile. Now, I don't know what the acid test was for that to make sure that someone was a Gentile, but if you went in, remember the balustrade said that you're taking your life into your own hands if you do that. So they're telling lies about Paul. Have you ever seen anyone tell any lies that'll start a riot? Oh, surely not in our day and time, right? Yeah, well, and there's a lot more besides that. Okay, go ahead, Josh.
The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops
that guy is who? The commander of the Roman troops? What's his title? Chiliarch. You probably won't remember anything today except for the Chiliarch. Okay?
While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul.
Why? Why would they stop beating Paul when the commander and the troops came out? Shouldn't have been doing it to begin with, but but what else? Was it a crime to cause a riot in the Roman Empire when you weren't Romans? It was a crime, right? And so they're not like a lot of our people that we have in this country today. When the police show up, they just keep going here in lawlessness that we have in our society. Back then, they knew that the law would be enforced, right? That's what the Romans were there for. So they stopped beating Paul. Go ahead, 33.
The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with two chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing, and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed him kept shouting, "Get rid of him."
Have you heard this before? Have you heard this before from these Jewish brethren? What did they say about Jesus when he was up on the steps at the Praetorium? Crucify him! This is the same crowd, probably, that shouted, "Crucify him." And they're doing the same thing with Paul. Okay? 37.
As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic.
And he's about to go into a sermon here. But notice that Paul, the guy, he apparently responded to the Roman soldier in Greek. He spoke to him in Greek. And he asked, do you speak Greek? Because he thinks he's this Egyptian that started a revolt in the desert. And Paul basically says who he is and where he's from and that he's a citizen. Not that he's a citizen of Rome, but that he's a citizen. And then he speaks to the crowd in Aramaic. Now, why would they have quieted down whenever he started speaking Aramaic to them? That was the language of the Mideast. It's much like English is around the world today as far as a business language. That back in that day and time, Aramaic was spoken all over the Mideast. You know, we think that they spoke Hebrew. Nobody spoke Hebrew except for the Jewish folk, right? And in Greek, because of all the history and the culture and everything as far as the Alexander the Great and everything, spoke Greek as well. But Aramaic was a Middle Eastern language. So when they hear him speak, first of all in Greek, and then he speaks in Aramaic, maybe this guy might have something to say. So let's see what Paul has to say. Go ahead. Okay, we're in chapter 22 now.
"Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death.
Hold on. Were any of you here last week in class? What was the way? We talked about that in class last week, right? The church, Christianity. It was the way. In fact, I don't know if we mentioned this last week, but if you look at Acts and you look across Acts, you'll see that this is referred to, they were first called Christians at Antioch. But if you look across Acts, you'll see there's more references to the way than what there is as far as Christian or the Church of Christ. The way. It's a number of times in here. So this way is Christianity. Verse 4 again, Josh, and keep going.
I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" I asked. "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting," he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. "What shall I do, Lord?" I asked. "Get up," the Lord said, "and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do." My companions led me by the hand into Damascus because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, "Brother Saul, receive your sight." And at that very moment I was able to see him. Then he said, "The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name."
Have you ever heard that before? In the scriptures anywhere? Isn't this the command, and isn't it the thing that follows through? It's immediate that you find people who believe and who go through the confession that they believe, that they do immediately what has been commanded in the scriptures, and that is to be buried with Christ in baptism. You see this over and over and over again in Acts, do we not? Okay, go ahead.
When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. "Quick," he said, "leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me." "Lord," I replied, "these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, 'Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles.'"
Uh-oh. Then it really gets under their skin. I think I forgot to click this thing. I did. So as we say it here, Paul is preaching the last gospel sermon that he ever will in front of these people. And we're going to see that Paul, through this uproar, that the Jewish soldiers take him away. So in verse 21 it says, "Then the Lord said to me, 'Go, and I'll send you far away to the Gentiles.'" Go ahead, Josh, starting in 22.
The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, "Rid the earth of him, he's not fit to live."
Have you heard this before? Same crowd. "Crucify him! Get rid of him!" Tough folks. Tough folks. The Lord in the Old Testament talked about these folks a lot. Hard-hearted. You ever heard that term? Hard-hearted. Stiff-necked. Yes, sir.
It seems they were pretty ignorant of the scriptures because, Genesis 12, there was going to be a blessing for all nations. So the fact that they didn't see that, kind of sets you back. They think that they would understand.
Yes. Raven says that out of Genesis 12, that when they were basically commanded, but also led to be a blessing to all people on earth, that they'd completely forgot about what their mission was, right? we all need to be reminded about our mission every now and then too. It's one of the reasons that we're studying Acts. It's so that we understand that we still have a mission to perform. You can get into mission creep even in the church today, can you not? If you're not held steadfast with the Word. So, these are pretty tough folks. Verse 23, Josh. Well, watch this. Excuse me for interrupting you again. You get used to it though, don't you? I want you to picture this scene in your mind. Don't just read it. Picture the scene in your mind as to what's about to take place here. These people are seriously upset. They're seriously upset. You don't believe it? Go 23, Josh.
As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air.
Can you believe this? That'd be like me taking my coat off, throwing it up in the air, getting a bunch of dust on the ground, and throwing dust in the air.
You ought to see Italians go at it.
John, I can always depend upon you to add some flavor to the class. John said you ought to see Italians go at it. But I mean, these folks are seriously upset, right? They're tearing off their outer garment, reaching down, grabbing dust, throwing it up in the air. I mean, this is absolutely, they're offended by everything that's going on here. Shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust in the air. Verse 24, Josh.
The commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship." "But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains.
The commander was trying to make some points here, some one-upsmanship, saying, it cost me a bunch of money for my citizenship. But when Paul responded to him and said, I was born a citizen, then the commander knew that his family were all citizens. And that kind of shut him down for a little bit. And so they withdrew immediately. Why? Why would they withdraw from once they found out Paul was a Roman citizen? Why would they withdraw? It's against the law, right?
And that law, if I remember correctly, they would be punishable of the exact, they get the same punishment for what they had done.
Yeah, a little bit different, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, a little bit there, right, as far as Roman law was concerned. So you're not going to punish a Roman citizen without what we call today, and one of the things downstream that we get from the Greeks and the Romans is due process. You familiar with that term? Due process. You got to be charged with a crime, you got to have witnesses, you got to go through a trial, a legal trial, and so they cut Paul a little slack here. So just read verse 30, if you will.
The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them.
Somewhat of a similar circumstances to what Jesus went through, right? So we're going to take him for a trial before the Sanhedrin. We're going to take him in with his own brethren, and we're going to present the evidence, and we're going to see what they have to say. Now, you have to give the Romans some credit here, right? I mean, they are going through a little bit of due process and respect, and the Romans were known for this across the empire at basically understanding that people had some rights, as long as they adhered to Roman law, but they had some rights as far as the legal system was concerned. Okay, now we're going to hit chapter 23. Chapter 23. Go ahead. I understand your hesitance. Go ahead.
Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God and all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck.
Okay, hold on. So, Paul is in close proximity to these folks, right? And how could he not recognize, this is Paul. How could he not recognize who the high priest was? He'd been out of town for a while? Could be, I've never heard that one. Huh? What do we know about Paul? He had a thorn in the flesh, did he not? Yeah. There was difficulty potentially that Paul's eyes were affected. Now, I don't know if that was from whenever he was struck blind out there on the road to Damascus or what might have been the circumstance. But we know that Luke traveled with Paul. Luke's profession was what? A physician, right? So he traveled with Paul because Paul needed medical assistance. We know that from other scriptures. But he had could have been an eyesight problem. It could have been something wrong with his eyes. And so he may not have seen this. And whenever he said this, he didn't realize this was the high priest. And we'll see that whenever the people in verse 4 tell him that. Josh?
Those who were standing near Paul said, How dare you insult God's high priest? Paul replied, Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. Then Paul, knowing that
Look at what Paul does here now. Look at what he does. Watch.
Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead. When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man, they said. What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks.
Boy, there's a lot of folks getting worked up here, isn't there? There's a lot of folks really getting worked up here. Pharisees and Sadducees going at it in the Sanhedrin. Paul knew exactly what he was doing, right? Verse 11.
The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.
So here in this very simple statement, in verse 11, we see something that should make us marvel as far as the plan of God. He's going to take Paul. He's already been to Athens. He's already been to Corinth. He's already been to Thessalonica. He's already been to all of these places. And now the road is going to lead him right to the center of the Roman Empire. Do you see God's hand at work here as far as Paul is concerned? He's going to take him to the capital, right into the midst of the beast to preach the gospel. Okay, so Paul is under some danger here. Verse 12.
The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priest and the elders and said, We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you in the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here.
Hold on. Now that's according to Jewish law, is it not? No trial. No accusations, no witnesses. Wait a minute, there's a commandment about that, right? About killing someone? They're disobeying God's law, one of the main commandments, right? So, go ahead.
But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him. So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you. The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, What is it you want to tell me? He said, Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me."
So there's a threat on Paul's life. And the Romans, because it's the Roman citizens, are going to take action here. Go ahead, verse 23.
Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix."
Okay, hold on just a second. Okay, so those of you at the back, you're probably not going to be able to see this, so I'll have to interpret a little bit for you here. Jerusalem is down here. Down here. There's Jerusalem. And he's going to go on the road up through here to Antipatris, which you'll see in just a minute. So the trip from Jerusalem to Caesarea was about 70 miles. Antipatris, that you'll see here, is about 30 miles. That's when some of the soldiers take off and go back home. So just, not that it makes any difference to you, because you're all used to putting your foot on the accelerator and getting places. But cavalry could go about 35 miles in 8 hours. Foot soldiers could go about 30 miles in 8 hours. And that's hustling, 30 miles in 8 hours, right? Any of you ever been in the military? What was the longest march you ever took? 16 miles? No wonder you're skinny.
I did the math in my head, so I could be wrong, but I think it's 16 minutes per mile. And I might be wrong on that.
Yeah.
It's really moving.
Yeah, it's moving. But plus you think about it, they got armor on, and the horses could go, of course, faster. If you note the time by car to Antipatris, you're looking at 55 minutes, 54 minutes, 1 hour, 2 minutes, depending upon which route you take. And as you go along this trip, if you see from Jerusalem, and we've already talked about in the book of Acts how many times it's talked about how they go up to Jerusalem, or they go down from Jerusalem and go to various places. And forget the picture in the bottom right corner, but just so that you know the territory that Paul is going through here and how they're going to go through some of the Samaritan foothills. They go through the hills of Judea, the Judean Valley, and of course Ashdod is down south. And that was where Philip went back whenever we were talking about Philip and the centurion. But you can see doesn't look all that unlike, I think we mentioned this before, as far as getting into the hill country here in Texas. If you're going through, these are actual pictures of the countryside. So, where are we? We're already into this, aren't we? You're where? 25. Go for it, man. The first bell already rang and people are salivating because they want a donut.
He wrote a letter as follows: Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency, Governor Felix.
Okay, so I misspoke earlier because I said the commander was not named. He is named. Claudius Lysias.
Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace.
Okay, so he's going to the governor of the region, Governor Felix. We're not going to go there today. Lord willing, we're going to go there next week. I'll tell you about Felix Antonius next week. And there's going to be another fellow that's going to come in that is the governor of where Paul was from, because they're basically going to try Paul from the place of where he was from originally. Now, if you go, you might remember this, Caesarea from the earlier, if you go up north, which we said was about 70 miles from Jerusalem to Caesarea, I think you can see it even at the back maybe, in the round red circle on the left over here. This is Caesarea, a beautiful place. I know that some of you in here have been here. A beautiful place with beautiful water. Up in the top right-hand picture is everything that Herod had built, including a temple to Augustus. But he also built a beautiful palace that you see in the circle over there where B is. And of course, you want to be seaside if you're going to build a beautiful palace, right? So he built a beautiful palace. Now, the interesting thing here is that Paul isn't taken, it doesn't say to a dungeon, right? He's not taken to a dungeon. Where's he taken? Where's he under guard? Herod's palace. Look in 35. He's taken to Herod's palace. So he's being treated pretty well because they know he's a Roman citizen, so they're taking him to Herod's palace at Caesarea Maritima. We're going to pick up there, Lord willing, next Lord's Day, and then we're going to see about these trials, and there's some interesting, Paul almost, well, not almost, but goes into sermons talking here as he's with the judges, as he's with the governors and the people in command. Okay, anything else? Has the second bell rang? It's all right, I can tell by looking on your face you want a donut. Thanks a whole lot for being here today, and next week we're going to be, Lord willing, in 24 and 25 next week. Thank you.